Beth, go ahead and get started.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. We've got a couple slides scrolling on screen, but I just wanted to make sure we welcomed everybody today to July's Lunch and Learn, from ADA, or the American Disabilities Act, to Olmstead, to the Innovations Waiver and home and community-based supports. Where are we now? Want to thank you all for coming to the table today. Many of you are coming again. You've joined us for other webinars. We do this once a month, the third Tuesday at noon. Today we're going a little longer. We're going to 1:30 rather than going just till 12. So it's noon to 1:30 today. We've got a really amazing group of presenters for you today, and we'll also make sure that we've got enough time for Q&A at the end. Next week on July 26th, and this is every year, we celebrate the American Disabilities Act, or what we say ADA. And we thought it was a fitting time to stand back and put a foundation to where we are today with respect to disability rights in North Carolina. This is extremely important as we shift towards community inclusion in our state. Learn how important your voice is to making our collective dream of ADA and Olmstead possible. I'm Beth Field, and I'm the program director for the Leadership Alliance for Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, or what we call LAND. We're a grassroots advocacy organization made up of people with lived experience. And for us, lived experiences would be those who have an intellectual or other developmental disability, or a parent or caretaker. I'm also the host of your Lunch and Learn webinars. And LAND is also the backbone organization of the collective impact initiative called Meet the Need NC, with a mission of meeting the service and support needs of the IDD community in North Carolina. We're also a grant that's funded by the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities. If you were here last time or have joined our mailing list, you would have received our June newsletter with recording, presentation, and answers to questions that we didn't get to during the last presentation last month. Our follow-on monthly newsletters have additional resources to extend your understanding around Lunch and Learn topics. For June, last month, our topic was the Registry of Unmet Needs, or the RUN, or the Innovations Waiver waitlist. We're going to have the same format for our newsletter this July as well. So make sure you register for our webinars and you get on our mailing list so you stay informed. Now, today's presentation is about the fundamental underpinning of why we do what we do, disability rights. We are pleased and honored to have a group of long-term disability advocates who've given their careers to work tirelessly for those with intellectual and other developmental disabilities and their families. I'm going to introduce each to you, and then we're going to follow with their presentations, and then we're going to go on to Q&A. Please put your Q&A in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please do not put your Q&A in the chat. We'll only be addressing Q&A in the Q&A box. We also, you will notice that we have interpretation with American Sign Language. We've got ASL interpreters. We also have a Spanish translator, and there should be information in the chat about how to get to that. We also have cart captioning for inclusive accommodations today. So let me go ahead and introduce these wonderful panelists. And I usually don't read about who we have presenting, but you got to know about these folks today. So bear with me, please. The first one is Virginia Knowlton Marcus, and she's the CEO of Disability Rights North Carolina, a nonprofit law firm and the protection and advocacy organization in North Carolina dedicated to advancing the rights of people with all kinds of disabilities of all ages throughout North Carolina. She's an attorney with lived experience and has been advocating for disability rights in multiple states, federally and internationally, for over 25 years. She chairs the North Carolina Equal Justice Alliance and is a member of the National Disability Rights Network Board of Directors and Legislative Committee. NC Equal Access to Justice Commission, and many other organizations. And she was recently recognized by Lawyers Weekly as a North Carolina leader in law. Virginia has earned her JD and BA in international relations at University of California, Davis, and lives in North Carolina with her husband, Michael, and her German Shepherd, Rosie. Our second presenter, and many of you know her, Holly Riddle. She leads the Olmstead Plan development for the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, or what we call with the acronym NCDHHS. She's the assistant director in the DHHS office of the senior advisor on the ADA. Over her 4 decades, listen to that, 4 decades in government, she has served in addition as policy advisor to the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Use Services, Executive Director of the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities, General Counsel to the former NCDHHS Division of Youth Services, and a staff member of Wright School and the Whitaker Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility. She's a former member of the American Bar Association's Commission on Mental and Physical Disability Law and many boards. In 2013, the North Carolina Council of Developmental Disabilities created an award in her name, recognizing excellence in professional leadership in the field of developmental disability. She holds a bachelor's in English and a master's degree in special ed, and from UNC Chapel Hill, and a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. And last but not least, of course, we've got Marti Knisley, and she served as a local and state human services administrator and consultant for over 5 decades, including serving as director of Department of Mental Health in Ohio in the District of Columbia, and deputy secretary of mental health in the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare. She has advised state and federal agencies in the development of supportive housing and supported employment, Medicaid financing, and community policies and services for people with disabilities. And she's presently the independent reviewer in the Olmstead settlement agreement between the state of North Carolina and the U.S. Department of Justice. She served as expert consultant to the New Jersey Department of Human Services from 2008 to 2017, assisting the state to successfully meet requirements in their Olmstead case, Disability Rights, New Jersey versus Velez. She serves as an expert on supported housing in a similar matter, U.S. versus Georgia. She has served as an expert consultant to the Council of State Governments, Justice Center, the National Governors Association, Substance Abuse, Mental Health, and Services Administration, and to the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. Wow. Let's get started. Let's get started, ladies. We have what I want to tell you what we said to these 3 today. This is their platform to talk about disability rights and where we are now here in North Carolina. They are going to, they've all created their separate presentations. I just wanted to give that caveat that this is going to be a wonderful discussion. You'll have the presentations available to you afterwards. So Virginia, let's get started, and then you kick it off to the next.
Thank you, Beth. And do we have the slide available? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your time and attention today. That's the second presentation. Should I share my screen?
1 second, Beth. Sorry, 1 second, Virginia. I was confused by which one was which. Is this correct?
No, that's the last presentation.
Oh, I had the other one up. Let me put it right back.
It's just the single slide. Yeah.
Right, that's what, okay. I literally had that, didn't I?
Mhm.
Oh, there it is. It's in front of me.
There it is. So, welcome everyone. We wanted to just provide a little historical context for our presentations before we launch into those. So the slide that you see shows some images from the history of disability rights. And I hope they serve as a reminder that all the progress we have achieved, all the opportunities that we have available to us now is because of all the long, hard struggles and challenging work of the ones who came before us. We stand on the shoulders of giants. In the upper left-hand corner is a photo of Judy Human, who is speaking. Judy, we recently lost just a little over 4 months ago. She was such a friend and mentor to so many of us. You may have heard that she is called the mother of the disability rights movement. But Judy says, some people say that what I did changed the world, but really, I simply refused to accept what I was told about who I could be, and I was willing to make a fuss about it. So inspired by the civil rights movement that Black folks engaged in the 60s, the disability rights movement emerged, and people just decided to stop accepting the tyranny of low expectations and to fight to be included, and for people to recognize that disability is simply part of the human experience. So Judy really cut her teeth in the fight for the Section 504 regulations. As many of you know, they overtook a federal building in San Francisco and held it for almost a month. And the regulations were signed, and people with disabilities were shown their strength. And we've been fighting ever since. Below the picture of Judy is a picture of the Capitol crawl. And this was one of the many events that led up to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you can see the signing by President H.W. Bush, with Justin Dart looking over his shoulder in the top right image. And imagine getting such a sweeping, comprehensive civil rights act passed today. It is mind-boggling. And one of the reasons that we have the ADA is people with disabilities chose not to play divide and conquer. They tried to peel off groups, separate them from each other, make promises separately to each group, and everybody stood shoulder to shoulder. They stood strong. They refused to play that game. And that's why we have such a strong cross-disability Civil Rights Act that we can rely on still to this day. In a week and a day, it's going to be 33 years old. Think about that. So there's so many disabled folks right now who don't know any other world besides a world where there's an Americans with Disabilities Act. So about 24 years ago, there was a major Supreme Court case. You can see the named plaintiffs in the center picture. That's Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis. And they wanted to live in the community. They did not want to be relegated to life in a facility. And that's what we commonly refer to as the Olmstead decision today. The final image in the lower right is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who authored that landmark decision. So that is sort of where we are now. fighting for our rights under the ADA and Olmstead. And with that, I will go back on mute, and Holly, take it away.
Thank you so much, Virginia. And thank you so much for having me. I'm a woman in her 60s with short brown hair. And today I have on a mustard yellow top. I'm going to talk to you about Olmstead, and I'd love to see the slides up in front of me if I could get them up. Thank you. Very good. Okay, you can move to the next slide. Virginia's already told you what the Olmstead decision is. It's a United States Supreme Court case or a decision, and it's about the right, as she said, to community inclusion for people with disabilities. I don't know many people who wouldn't tell you that this isn't the most important civil rights decision that we have for people with disabilities in this country. Because it's a United States Supreme Court decision, all of the states, North Carolina included, have got to come into line or comply with what the court said in the Olmstead decision. Next slide. I just want to acknowledge that these are my heroes. This is why I went to law school. There they are again, Lois in purple, Elaine in white, and the attorney that led the charge, Sue Jameson. Next slide. Now, the Olmstead decision comes from a piece of law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Like Virginia said, it got passed in 1990, and it has in it what we call the integration mandate. Basically, that mandate says that people with disabilities have a right to get services in the most integrated setting that'll meet their needs. The ADA has got its own rules or regulations, and the regulations tell us a little more about what the integration mandate means. Those regulations say that an integrated setting lets people with disabilities be without people with disabilities or people who are temporarily able-bodied to the fullest extent possible. So what does that mean? It basically means that people with disabilities have a right to live in the community with everybody else. Next slide, please. Well, there was 9 years that went by between the passage of the ADA and the Supreme Court saying, we need to tell you a little bit more about that integration mandate. They did that in the Olmstead case. And the court told the country the changes that it was going to need to make in the way that we think about where people live and how people live their lives. The Olmstead decision, at least in my opinion, changes the way that states go about supporting people to have what I'd call everyday lives. And the Olmstead decision is the law of the land. That means it's the whole United States. Next slide, please. So what did the United States Supreme Court, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, say in Olmstead versus LC? The court said that the unjustified segregation or separation of people with disabilities in institutions was, these are their words, unlawful discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. What does that mean, unlawful discrimination? It means that it's against the law to treat somebody less well than other people because of their disabilities. And in Olmstead, it means that it's against the law to require people with disabilities to go to institutions or other large segregated places just because they need services. Next slide. More about what the court said in Olmstead. The court said that state agencies like DHHS and their partners like LMEMCOs and providers must provide community-based services to people with disabilities when such services are appropriate. That's a whole lot of the time, folks, if not the vast majority of the time. They have to provide those services when the person isn't against getting services in the community. That means that people and families and guardians get to make the choice that's right for them. And lastly, that offering community-based services doesn't make it hard for the state to run a service system for people with disabilities. So that's sort of the legalese. I put it in my own language, but I think that's more or less what they said. Next slide. Ruth Bader Ginsburg went on to say that if a state got sued in an Olmstead case, that state could potentially defend itself if it had, and these are the court's words, a comprehensive, effectively working plan and a waiting list that moved at a reasonable pace. So what we're doing in North Carolina with our Olmstead plan is lining up our service delivery system through that plan with the United States Supreme Court case, Olmstead versus LC. That link right there goes to the plan. Next slide. So, who's North Carolina's Olmstead plan about? It's about people with disabilities who live in facilities. What does that mean? For example, a developmental center, a psychiatric hospital, a skilled nursing facility, an adult care home. It's about people in other segregated settings too. For example, sheltered workshops or segregated day programs, or a program for children psychiatric rehabilitation treatment facilities. Olmstead is also, though, about people who are at serious risk of entering a setting like those I've described. Our plan covers all people with disabilities of all ages, both adults and children. And those are all people with disabilities in the public system, I should add. Next slide. The Olmstead Plan is a blueprint for offering people opportunities to live and work and receive services in the community in integrated, inclusive settings. It's a plan to help people get out of institutions or to avoid going there in the first place. Another way to think about it is it's a lens for the work that every professional does every day. It sets out priorities for what the state's going to do and the action steps the state's going to take, and the goals and outcomes that the state plans to achieve by moving the Olmstead Plan forward. Next slide. At least as long as I can remember, when we do work like this in the Department of Health and Human Services, we put together a group of people to advise us. The Olmstead Plan has a stakeholder advisory. It's a very diverse group of people. They don't always disagree, but everybody's offering their best thinking on this. It's made up of policymakers, legislators, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 senators, 2 representatives, people with lived experience, and professional organizations, agencies, and associations. When the OPSA, that advisory, meets, it's quarterly and it's always open to the public. It's chaired by two really talented people with lived experience, Betsy McMichael, who's handling our facilitation today, and Brian Dooley, the chair of the Council on Developmental Disabilities. Next slide. So what's happened so far? I'm going to tick this off kind of quick. We hired help, the Technical Assistance Collaborative, and they did a really long report. I put the link to it there to sort of tell everybody what the state looked like, what we had going for us, and where we had work to do. Then the department hosted its first Olmstead Plan stakeholder advisory in July of 2020, and working with the TAC, as we call them, the department put what it heard from lots of different people into a plan for the first 2 years, calendar year 2022 and 2023. Next slide. We also put together a staff work group. It crosses about 8 or 9 divisions. It's a group of people with expertise in program issues in the Department of Health and Human Services or data issues. Next, hired this really brainy group of people, Mathematica. Their job is to help us gather data and to pick or develop the measures that are going to tell North Carolina how the state is progressing in its implementation of the plan. We get ideas and input about that plan all the time, often in meetings like this, and the OPSA continues to advise the state on which way to go and so on and so forth. Next slide. The Olmstead Plan itself includes 11 priorities, and I wrote those out there, and I'll mention a couple of them. I ain't got time to mention them all. Strengthening choice, addressing the direct support professional crisis, increasing competitive integrated employment, increasing input from people with lived experience, and using data for quality. There are other ones, and I've listed them all 11, I think, there. The department updates the plan and puts out reports on the website that we have every 3 months. And we are gearing up right now to write the 2024-2025 installation of the Olmstead Plan. Next slide. Couple of things about the plan. The plan overarches, it umbrellas over transitions to community living. That is a settlement agreement. We got sued. The state of North Carolina got sued. And it's an example of the state coming into line with Olmstead. I always call it Olmstead in action. But it's for just one group of people. It's for people with serious mental illness and serious and persistent mental illness. The plan also builds on money follows the person. I have the opportunity to work with my colleague and friend, Steve Strom, who directs that. Money follows the person is the federal government giving all the states that decided they were in money to push the Olmstead agenda and build their community capacity. The Olmstead Plan also connects to our strategic housing plan. That plan includes the people with disabilities that are part of the Olmstead population. The Olmstead Plan includes standard plans, and when they go live, it will also include the tailored plans. It embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide. This is the vision statement that the Olmstead Plan Stakeholder Advisory adopted. North Carolina champions the right of all people with disabilities to choose to live life fully included in the community. Next slide. All the meetings are open to the public. You guys can come and comment at the end of each meeting, and we post those minutes online. Next slide. The bottom line is this plan is a huge change of thinking in the way that professionals do their work and in what families ask of us. It gives community inclusion a huge boost. It's a new language that everybody will speak and a lens for seeing a world where everybody belongs. But it's going to take all of us advocating and working together. Next slide. That's more about the plan. And the last slide is where you find me. With that said, I'll turn it over to our next presenter. And I believe that would be Marti. Is it Marti's up next? Or is it, yeah, Marti's up next. Marti Knisley. Take it away, Marti, and thank you.
Thanks, Holly and Virginia, for opening this up and giving us a whirlwind tour through both North Carolina's efforts with OMSA, but also from Virginia to start with the history of Olmstead. I'm going to just touch on a few highlights that kind of add to both what Virginia said and what Holly has provided you information about, and then get more into one of the reasons that I'm here today as the independent reviewer in the current settlement agreement between the U.S. and the state of North Carolina. So if I can move to my first or number 2 there, slide, that would be great. And to reintroduce you to Lois Curtis, who is handing President Obama one of her paintings. And this was during a Olmstead celebration back over 10 years ago. So there have really been 3 different pieces of federal legislation, or 1 court decision and 2 pieces of legislation over a 30+ year period, almost 30-year period, to show you how the arc of change takes a long time on the legislative side, as well as on the side of where we all work, where people live. And those decisions at the federal level open doors for so many people, as we've been talking about already today. I found 2 quotes from Olmstead that I think are really important about where we came from, because one of the reasons why these decisions and acts were so important is that people were living in institutions, large institutions, with no opportunity to move to the community. And here you see 2 quotes from Ruth Bader Ginsburg regarding these institutional placements. I should have said at the beginning, I'm actually a white woman wearing a white top in my 70s. So I worked back in these institutions before the Rehab Act, before the ADA, and before the Olmstead decision. And every time one of these decisions got made, I was bursting with energy, along with a lot of other advocates, about what was possible for the future. But our journey, as we know, has opened doors for some people, but not all at once, and not without the hard-fought battles that continue today. Our battles today may be somewhat different than they were back in 1990 or back in 1973. For example, here in North Carolina, and it's already up in the Q&A today, you know, what about the waiting list? When I started this work, we didn't have waiting lists because we didn't have anyone waiting yet. And today, that's one of the big battles that is different than where we came from. Let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to focus a bit more on one issue that or finding that Holly mentioned, and that is that the Olmstead decision focuses on state responsibilities because state policy dictates the expenditures, how federal funds are used and allocated, and what our program priorities are going to be. That's why a state is important. And because the two women, Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis, were not offered initially an opportunity to move to the community, that was a state decision. That's why the focus on states in the Olmstead decision. But going back to 504, which was passed in the Rehab Act, back in 1973, you know, the federal government was basically saying a person cannot be excluded from participation in or denied benefits with activities funded with federal assistance distributed by state and local government or any other instrumentality. And this is really important. What is an instrumentality? It's a private provider. It's a housing provider. It's anyone funded or provided resources from the state or federal government. That's a wide group of people, organizations, and places. Next slide, please. So since the ADA 504 in Olmstead, the federal and instrumentalities, we followed the lead as Virginia spoke about of families, disability rights, legal organizations and activists, philanthropy, researchers, progressive educators, and provider groups have led the way, sometimes together, sometimes separately, towards realizing the potential of these hard-fought legal battles. They've taken more progressive steps to transform systems, change regulations, payment priorities, and services. A lot has happened all across the country to take these progressive steps. Perhaps maybe one of the most successful steps was when President Obama issued an executive order in 2009. And remember, Olmstead passed and became a law in 1999, and the ADA was in 1990, and the Rehab Act was in 1973. All the way to 2009, he directed federal agencies to take action to implement Olmstead. And the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services did that. The Department of Labor, HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, and the U.S. Department of Justice began issuing policy and being more active, investigating complaints about Olmstead not being enacted, and as now taken legal action all across the country. Sadly, legal actions are still necessary and in process across the country. A judge in Florida just last week issued a ruling in a case for children in nursing homes. And many other legal actions are in process across the country. I think most of us would hope that the steps that we could take to implement these laws and this decision could come through our own action without and progressive steps rather than legal actions that take a long time to bring and a long time to come to fruition. But sadly, we are still there. Let's go to the next slide. It hasn't been a straight line, as I just said. We have special interest groups that are still opposed to change. Sometimes it has to do with their employment in institutions. Sometimes it has to do with contracts you have to keep institutions open. There are various different reasons why it's not a straight line. Sometimes in government would say, wait a minute, the federal government can't tell us what to do. Even though it is the law of the land, sometimes there are competing priorities that states must weigh to determine what they're going to fund, what's a priority. And I think one of the things that's really important, and Holly said this, that in the Olmstead decision, there was a recognition that sometimes moving quickly to dismantle an institutional system means that it makes it hard for the state to actually fund that. That's not been successful in court, by the way. I just wanted to make that clear to everyone, is that there is a way to fund community-based options while not necessarily closing or not funding institutional options. But you have to set a priority and you have to be smart about doing it. For housing, services, employment, all are underfunded in most states today. We're going to need more resources, but it can't be an either or, and it doesn't have to be an either or. And some states have already shown that. Sometimes there's a lack of support for integration and community inclusion across the board. Not for folks on this call, you're all here today to learn more about what you can do. There's sometimes misinformation about, what's required or what we can do. And sometimes it's because people continue to see a person's disability, not their ability and their will. And there hasn't been a straight line because the struggle comes from the negative impact of being a subject to long-term institutionalization, where loneliness sets in and fear sets in. So you have to be thoughtful about what services and supports to provide. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I think some folks on the call today want to say, okay, so you're the independent reviewer in this settlement agreement. What does that mean? What was the state required to do? The state was required to enter into this agreement after an investigation, first led by Disability Rights North Carolina, reaching out to the Department of Justice, because they had steered thousands of adults with serious mental illness into adult care homes. And they had been doing that, the state had been doing that for decades. There were findings that people being discharged from state psychiatric hospitals were moving to unstable housing, not providing a pathway for individuals to return to the community or be diverted from adult care homes, or to provide an integrated recovery-based system, including services, peer support, supported housing, and supported employment. Those were the findings. The agreement, and by the way, there were 103 requirements in this agreement. It's very comprehensive, one of the most comprehensive agreements in the country, to support 3,000 people to live in supported housing in the community from the target population identified in the agreement. 2,000 of those individuals must be individuals who had been previously living in adult care homes. The state's required to provide in-reach and transition and discharge to help people move, and pre-screening for people who can be diverted from moving to adult care homes, to create a community-based, recovery-based system at the intensity and frequency for individuals to move to and to live successfully in the community with their rights of tenancy, if they're in a rental agreement, and to get tenancy support, to provide supported employment with fidelity to an evidence-based model. That means, in plain language, provide supported employment in a way that works, with evidence that it works, and then to develop a QA/PI system to make sure that these requirements are being met. Next slide, please. And that's a very fast run through of 103 requirements. So We're 10 years after entering the agreement. The state has met compliance on two major requirements. On April 30th of this year, over 3,000 people were living in supported housing. There's a caveat, though, to that achievement, because only 1,205 people have moved from adult care homes, falling short of that requirement for 2,000. And I can answer questions about why that has happened. The state has reduced the number of people moving into adult care homes. When I came on as the reviewer in this case, over 900 people were moving to adult care homes every year because they didn't have any other choice. That has come down to less than 65 last year, fiscal year. And at the end of April this year, only 61 people had moved to adult care homes. In other words, we're not growing the problem anymore. The problem's being reduced. And the state has created a viable rental assistance program. And for all of you on this call today, I would say to you that that viable rental assistance program can work successfully for individuals across all of the disability groups. It doesn't have to be just for people in TCL. You can see to the right there is a new multifamily rental project that has a set aside units for people who are of all disability groups in Swannanoa, North Carolina, that just won an award, a national award. Moving on quickly here. We've got some challenges. The IPS system isn't where it needs to be yet. Only less than 20% of individuals who have already said they want employment or education are actually referred to get it. The services are not consistently provided to the required evidence-based recovery model and required tenancy support. However, for some folks in some communities, with working with a couple of the LMEs, I can say are showing real promise to help people live successfully in the community. And we still got systems changes, workforce issues, and COVID that created delays and new challenges. And my last slide. Sorry to be going so fast, everyone, but we want to give plenty of time for Q&A. The state is providing funding for more bridge housing and crisis residences, enabling individuals to help make their transition successful. This is really important for people being discharged from state psychiatric hospitals. Got a new complex care initiative showing promising results for individuals with medical challenges and physical disabilities, new peer-led bridger services, and LME MCOs taking on more responsibility, working with property managers and peers to take advantage of new housing options that are on the horizon. You've seen a couple of slides with pictures from the Creative Renovations in Columbus, Ohio, and Creative Housing. This is an organization that I got a chance to be a board member of back in 1990. And they're doing great work for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in that community for over 1,100 people living in their own home today in that city. The reason I'm showing you this is I know this works. I've seen it, and I am hopeful that this state will continue to make progress with the hope and vision that we all need and aspire to have for our fellow residents of the state of North Carolina with able individuals, I should say. And with that, I believe I'm turning it back to Virginia.
Yes, I think so, Marty. And I want to pause just for a second. I just want to make sure that we've got the other Spanish interpreter online. I know we've been trying to do that. Okay, well, let's move to Virginia, and then we will move to Q&A. Remember, please put your any questions in the Q&A box. And Marty, I'm just always amazed about what you've done across the country. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marty. That was very informative.
Quick.
So back to Olmstead. As you have heard, Olmstead is a Supreme Court decision that interprets the meaning of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in passing that act, Congress made some findings on the record. One of the findings that our Congress made was that historically, society has tended to isolate and segregate individuals with disabilities, and despite some improvements, such forms of discrimination against individuals with disabilities continue to be a serious and pervasive social problem. Again, the ADA is turning 33 years old this month. So here in North Carolina, Olmstead's been the law of the land for 24 years. We are still faced with the landscape of unmet needs and unfulfilled promises. Next slide, please. So again, Holly has described what an Olmstead plan needs to be, an effectively working plan and waiting list that moves at a reasonable pace. So I want to talk a little bit about the United States Department of Justice's definition of an Olmstead plan. And I'll read from the slide. An Olmstead plan is a public entity's plan for implementing its obligation to provide individuals with disabilities opportunities to live, work, and be served in integrated settings. A comprehensive, effectively working plan must do more than provide vague assurances of future integrated options or describe the entity's general history of increased funding for community services and decreased institutional populations. Instead, it must reflect an analysis of the extent to which the public entity is providing services in the most integrated setting, and it must contain concrete and reliable commitments to expand integrated opportunities. Concrete and reliable commitments. Next slide, please. So just to expand a little bit on what DOJ says about Olmstead plans, it says in order for an Olmstead plan to serve as a reasonable defense against legal action, it must include concrete and reliable commitments to expand integrated opportunities, and there must be funding to support the plan. DOJ went on to say that integrated settings are located in the mainstream society, offer access to community activities and opportunities at times, frequencies, and with persons of an individual's choosing, afford individuals choice in their daily life activities, and provide individuals with disabilities the opportunity to interact with non-disabled persons to the fullest extent possible. Evidence-based practices that provide scattered site housing with supported services
Yes,
are examples
da
of
diferentes
integrated settings.
servicios.
That's what Marty was talking about, those kinds of settings. Am I speaking too quickly?
No, I think you're doing great. I think they stopped the interpretation to probably add both interpreters, so we just
Okay.
You can go on, Virginia.
Okay, all right, thank you. So these settings that we're talking about are called HCBS, Home and Community-Based Services. Olmstead compliance requires access to HCBS. Here in North Carolina, most of these HCBS services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities depend on having an innovations waiver slot. Unfortunately, the waiting list for an innovations waiver slot is over 17,000 persons. That is more than the number who are being served with an innovation slot. More people are waiting than are being served. And those who are lucky enough to have that innovations waiver slot are struggling to find providers. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about North Carolina's lack of a true Olmstead plan. Having a real Olmstead plan means that it works to provide adequate HCBS. We don't have that. The United States Department of Justice requires that an Olmstead plan must have specific and reasonable timeframes and measurable goals for which the public entity may be held accountable, and there must be funding to support the plan. In the Samantha R case, I think some of you are familiar with the Samantha R case. It's on appeal right now. Disability Rights North Carolina won that case on summary judgment in February 2020. Also known as the last month we had freedom to move about the country before the pandemic. February 2020, we won that case on summary judgment. And now we're trying to work toward a remedy, a meaningful remedy in that case. So the judge in the Samantha R case reviewed the state's 2021-2023 Olmstead plan and determined that DHHS and the state have not provided an actionable plan with specific and measurable goals for compliance. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? We have to do this. Remember that first slide with Judy Heumann and Justin Dart and a capital crawl and Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis. Remember I talked about how people refused to play the divide and conquer game. People stood shoulder to shoulder. They stood strong and they fought for what they needed. They fought for their vision. They fought for what they knew they had a right to expect. So this community, the intellectual and developmental disability community and people with all disabilities in North Carolina have to be engaged and drive the change that we need here. We must demand an aggressive approach to eliminating the waiting list for services. We must demand that the new 1915I services are robust and can meet the unmet needs of those waiting for an innovations waiver slot. We must demand that the LME MCOs fulfill their duty to ensure that services are available for those who do have an innovations waiver slot. And we need to demand that the LME MCOs engage in in-reach and diversion to ensure that those who want to live in the community can do so that everybody has a choice. And with that, 101, perfect. We wanted to leave a half an hour for questions and we have left 39 minutes.
Perfect, Virginia. Thank you, Virginia and Holly and Marty. Now we're going to move to the Q&A section quickly. I just keep thinking about, standing on the shoulders of the people before us. That's just that keeps sticking with me. We're going to have now we're going to move into the Q&A session. We have Sarah Potter and Betsy McMichael, who will be helping to pose questions that have been put in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. For those that don't get answered, we'll be answering those afterwards in our newsletter. But I want to introduce to you Betsy McMichael, who you see on the screen now. She's a parent of a 31-year-old young adult living on her own with waiver supports. She's also executive director of First and Families North Carolina and community co-chair of the Olmstead Plan Stakeholder Advisory Committee. And she serves on various other stakeholder work groups, including Meet the Needs Policy Work Group. And we also have Sarah Potter with us today, and she's a longtime parent advocate with a 36-year-old son with cerebral palsy. She started her advocacy journey when he was 2, and the path has taken many twists and turns, changing focus as his needs evolved. One of the main goals was to help him become a self-advocate, and now he teaches her. Currently, she's a member of the North Carolina Waiver Action Team, Meet the Need, LAND, and the Forsyth IDD Advisory, and the Partners CFAC. Betsy and Sarah, you're going to pose questions to these 3 speakers, and whoever wants to answer the question can join in, and you can also join in with each other. Thanks.
Okay, I can start us off. There's a question for Marty, based on what you've seen in other states, can you identify what critical elements need to be in place here in North Carolina to move forward with supported community living?
Oh, wow. Why don't we start with a tough one, because it's there are so many things that need to be done. And my experience, I'll give you the states where I've seen the most success and where the challenges remain in the states that I've been asked to help as well. And I think number one is a sustained leadership from the executive branch of government, that sometimes with these cases extends over changes, political changes with elections, for example. So I can remember being in a press conference when we ended in New Jersey with the governor, Christie, saying, I wasn't around when this case was brought, but then he was taking full credit for actually getting it done. So I think that it's important to remember that the leadership for being successful in meeting as many of these requirements as possible comes from the all points in government, including the leadership and the executive government. Now, in North Carolina, we also have General Assembly with a great deal of authority. While a settlement agreement or even a consent decree, if it would come to that, which is a different legal mechanism, doesn't require the legislative branch to allocate funds. The fact is, you're going to have legislative leaders as well who understand, and will help drive community living as being important. Educating legislative leaders is extremely important. And I know from my history and where I've worked before, for example, in Pennsylvania, which has had some legal action in Olmstead, they've also had strong legislative support over time to fund additional services supports, regardless of who's leading the state at the time. So that's number one. You've got to have that strong leadership, and in order for that to happen, you got to have strong advocacy. And it's been mentioned several times today that you can't have one group advocating to get the resources and another group being left out. You've got to go in strong with advocates across all disabilities groups, families from all disability groups, and persons with lived experience from all disability groups. When I've seen that happen, I've seen more success. Sometimes we get pitted against each other, and I always say, wait a minute, we're fighting over crumbs. We should be together and fight for more. One of the problems in North Carolina, of course, is that the TCL recipients today are getting access to more services and housing. But it doesn't need to be that way going forward. And as I said before, the rental assistance program, the development funds for more housing, that blueprint is already laid for all disability groups. And there are steps that you can take to become part of that process. And I hope the state moves to that soon. Now, the staff at the state and the LMEs are responsible for meeting TCL would say, Marty, wait a minute, don't go there yet. We've got to meet this one first. But I don't think it's too early to begin planning for what do we need to do to get access to more housing. So I think that's going to be really important. There's so many other things to do. I could talk all day, but Jeff has just come back on screen. So
No. I was just going to underscore what Meet the Need has been about.
Yeah.
And that is cross disability.
Yes.
We need to join. We're climbing the same mountain. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marty.
I'll tell you one quick story about this. After Katrina, I was the services lead for the Department of Health in Louisiana. And the first meeting where we tried to bring homeless advocates, IDD advocates, legal advocates, and the NAMI advocates together, they started fighting with each other right in the meeting. And we said, stop, stop, stop. We all need to get together. And don't you know, they did. And they demanded change. And they would go to the Housing Finance Agency and everybody had on the same sticker. Everybody sat up front and everybody demanded change. And they got 3,000 units of supported housing, 5 changes in home and community-based services, as well as services for people with physical disabilities and with psychiatric disabilities, all at the same time. And it can be done. So I just had to tell you that story. It was a wonderful experience in a very bad situation. So did I answer it enough? I think.
I love that. I love that story. Now, Betsy and Sarah are going to pick out another question for the group.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, this is Sarah. I was going to go to the one at the top, and I'm not sure who can answer this, but someone is asking to understand how the innovations wait list or registry of unmet needs will be remedied so that the wait is no longer 9 or 10 years in length. And also what progress has occurred after the Samantha R. ruling.
I can
Up for
tackle that one.
grabs.
I can tackle that one. So again, in Samantha R, after people with disabilities won on summary judgment in February of 2020, OPSA was convened. The state spent a couple years working with TAC, coming up with an Olmstead plan. In August of last year, there was a ruling in which the judge in the case found that it did not have the measurable goals, the accountability, the requirements for an effectively working Olmstead plan. And so the judge issued an order. One of the elements of that order would have done away with the waiting list in a period of 10 years. I remember being overjoyed to see that, and then getting a response on our social media page from someone, a parent of a person with IDD, who said, I've already been waiting 10 years. How does this help me? And it broke my heart. So what was supposed to have happened was 10% of the people on that waiting list were to receive slots over a period of 10 years. So it was incremental over the course of a decade so that it was doable. Of course, the state decided, instead of implementing that order, to appeal the order. And so now it's, the order, the Samantha R case itself is on hold pending this appeal, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be fighting for what is in the order. We should still be fighting for those innovation waiver slots. 200 slots when 17,000 people are waiting, that doesn't even keep up with the growth in the waiting list. And it's not enough. We need more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia.
Yeah, the next question is, there's so much shortage of housing for the IDD community. How many people are still waiting for housing? What is the impact of North Carolina regulations on the low number of residents in adult care home? What impact does that have?
I don't know that there's data on the gap in housing. I believe that the state could order the LME-MCOs to find out and report that. I don't know that we have that.
Let me give you a couple of thoughts about that, in addition to what Virginia said, is that there is a shortage of housing, affordable housing, all across the country. And the HUD has been more active recently about changing some of the way they do business and fighting for more resources for housing. And the Housing Finance Agency here in North Carolina has been taking more assertive and aggressive steps to really create more housing opportunities as well. That wasn't the case when we started back on the TCL plan. As a matter of fact, they were basically saying, we don't have responsibility. Oh, but you're an instrumentality of the state. Yes, you do. And since 2016, 2017, they have been very active in providing more housing. And the reason I bring that up is that individuals who want to choose to live in their own home, sometimes with someone living with them. I just met a woman down in Fayetteville who's actually has a waiver slot, but is also getting support from TCL. That's another story, but there are opportunities for individuals to get housing. And that's what I was saying before, is that if we could come together on access to the housing that does exist, as well as promoting more ways to get more development through the funds that are available now, I think that you could have more housing available, but it's going to take work. And I think that that introducing the need, the waiver slots, by the way, there were over 20,000 people living in adult care homes when this settlement started. So that number's come down, and part of that's because of supported housing. Sadly, during COVID, many people died in adult care homes, and that's another reason the number came down. But it's because the state took action to put more money into developing housing. That picture I showed you, that's Swannanoa, not Swan Corner. Swannanoa is a suburb of Asheville in Buncombe County. And that there's housing there available for people in across disability groups. So but the steps are, there are necessary steps to make sure that that housing could be available. And even if you didn't have a slot, if you could make certain that the home and community services that are available for people would open it up so you can get tenancy support for a person to move, it might be possible to use some of the housing that's available for people while you're fighting for the slots. And don't get me wrong, you need every single slot you can get. So I don't want to say, oh, well, you can do it without it. That's not true. But there may be a subset of people who could benefit. And I urge those working on housing in the Olmstead plan to start considering how to help people using the same process, same in-reach transition, and help people move into housing across all disability groups. And it can be done, because even with the shortage of housing, there is housing set aside for people today with disabilities. And there is steps that you can take to reach out to organizations that are developing affordable housings, so you can be on the ground with them as they develop it. So I said a mouthful of all kinds of things that have to be done. I just want to say that I think it can be, and a lot more discussion about the how to, I'm sure.
Thank you, Marty. I have another topic here that should require a mouthful. Even for people who have the slot, the DSP workforce is a huge issue. So one of the questions is, with the DSP workforce issue, that is poor pay, poor training, especially for those with complex disabilities, poor recruitment strategies, data collection regarding turnover and retention, and career advancement is completely thwarting these rights, even for those with an innovation slot. Can you discuss some specific and actionable steps to address this chronic issue?
Yeah,
That question is up for grabs.
okay, I'll start it, and then I think hopefully my friends Holly and Virginia can add to this. Interestingly enough, I work with a group of people who are reviewers and court monitors. And this morning's topic, going round and round and round while I was trying to prepare my slides, was from this group talking about that very problem in other states. It's a huge issue, and it deserves immediate attention. And I'm not talking about just the salaries, although please, we can't even get started there. It's so, there's no misaligned, but it's also the help for the staff who are hired to do their jobs. We found in TCL, for example, that the workforce was not prepared to do the tenancy support in a way that was going to work for people. And today, many providers are being coached and mentored to ensure that they're providing the services and the supports that people need. And in TCL land, we've created a complex care initiative with additional support from occupational therapists and nurses to create a plan for staff to follow for every individual who needs that help when they move into their home. But that plan has to be implemented yet. And that's a big chore, I know, in TCL, and the workforce shortage is presenting overwhelming problems. I'm going to go back to my friends that were chatting this morning when I couldn't talk to them and see if anybody had any ideas, and I'll pass them on to Beth.
I'll take the workforce shortage. It's a national problem. It's going on everywhere. It probably stems in part from the fact that the baby boom cohort group of people is much, much larger than the generation of people who follow it. So there's a smaller number of people to provide the support. For starters, we've known for many years that this was going to happen in the United States. We do have a number of efforts going on in North Carolina to address the crisis. And in general, I think where we're going is this. We are moving towards the adoption of competency-based curricula, stacking those competencies in a way that we can associate demonstrated competencies with pay and by doing that, create a career path or a career lattice for this group of people. Also, we are looking at, and I'm very excited about this, the adoption of credentialing in North Carolina. That credentialing helps to allow DSPs to move from place to place, from provider to provider, and not have to be retrained. They can say, I have this credential. I am a DSP1, a DSP2, a DSP3. That's helpful. We also have a group in the state that are working on the important issue of increasing wages. I think we all know that given what we pay line staff, it is difficult to recruit and retain them. Those groups of people include an endeavor funded by Money Follows the Person with PHI, Duke, the Coalition on Aging. They're working on training. Our AHECs have been funded to look at credentialing, and there is a really exciting DSP workforce group advancing increased wages that's led by Annette Smith and Anna Cunningham with the support of some remarkable colleagues of mine, Dr. Pat Porter and Pam Shipman. It's not going to solve it tomorrow, but I think we are taking some important steps. So thank you for that.
I can add a little information and perspective too on DSP. I know it's a huge issue, direct support providers. That was also part of the order, and Samantha R. Actually, the parties come together and develop benchmarks. Credentialing was part of the order, but this is not a surprise. This is a storm that's been brewing for years, for at least a decade. In reports to the state, there were gaps, and the solutions are not that elusive. We have to pay people more. We have to make these jobs desirable jobs that people want to get and keep. And that means better pay, better working conditions, better training, career paths, all of that. I think the LME MCO accountability issue is ongoing. That is who is supposed to develop these provider networks. They get paid to do this, and they can set the rates so that they have the funds to do this, to recruit the people, to train the people. So that is the answer to the question about what to do about the DSP workforce shortage.
This is a key
Virginia.
issue with us that we continue to hear from everyone in the disability community as we talk about, where are we now and where we want to be. It also seems to be a key issue. So if we want more community and home-based supports, we need to have people who can provide that. I'm going to cap it off right now and thank Betsy and Sarah, because I want to ask one last question of these three, and then we'll close out for today. And that would be, part of what we talked about was from ADA to Olmstead to Innovations Waiver, where are we now? We've heard a lot about where are we now. For each of you, could you give me a minute or give this audience a minute on what are some of the key things that we need to have done to get from where we are now to where we want to be, to that promise, that hope?
I want to start that one. The North Carolina General Assembly and advocacy in the North Carolina General Assembly is a critical part of the equation. That's where the Department of Health and Human Services gets money to fund, for example, additional innovation waiver slots. So it is just so important that those of you with lived experience get in contact with your senators and representatives and let them know what you need and what your family or your individual story is. There are a lot of things that I could say, but that is probably, as the Department of Health and Human Services, I think the most important one. Let me turn it over to Virginia and Marty and see what they have to add to that. Thank you.
Marty, you want to go next or last?
I'll go last because I'm still writing mine down so I can get them into a minute.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, what we could do right now is this appeal is delaying the implementation of the Samantha R order. There's so much in that order that we need. It was a plan to, over 10 years, make meaningful progress that would stop the wait and provide the community integration that people with disabilities are legally entitled to and have been for many years. So we have moved to dismiss the appeal, and that is pending. I know that there was a date regarding the ICFs in the order that people were concerned about. We have asked the state to file a joint motion to remove that date. They didn't do that, so we filed that motion on our own, and it is pending, and that will be heard in a couple of weeks. So implement the order.
So it's hard to top those two. I think I would start by, I think sort of finding many different ways to publicize the issues. For example, you talked about the LME MCOs building a network with service providers. Some of the LME MCOs may be paying more than others. Why not publicize sort of the payment rates, what is getting paid for? Because sometimes that, what you report is then what you're going to get. And, I compare the LME MCOs in terms of what they're doing for people in the TCL program. I put that in my report. The first folks who read that, each other, about, well, wait a minute, how did this person get this score, or this LME get this score, and my scores are so low? And I'd like to say it's turned some folks around. Some it has and some it hasn't, but I think a scorecard is extremely important. And I know that Holly's keeping track of, what's going on in the plan, but I'm talking about a different kind of scorecard that advocacy groups could come together and say, this is where we stand in the state today. And I think that's really important because folks will read that, get that to the boards of the LMEs, get that to the GA, get that to all the decision makers, and hold folks accountable, just as you're trying to hold the state accountable on a number of actions that they need to take. The second thing, and the last thing that I have time for, is now is the time, because post-COVID, there's many more tax credit properties coming available in North Carolina. And these properties have set aside units for people with disabilities. And I would urge you all in your roles to find out more about how do we get access to these units in new properties with affordable rents that would make it possible for people to access quality housing, like the picture that I showed you. And I would urge you to take the steps now, because not all the housing is going to come available today. It's going to extend out for the next 2 to 3 years. There is no time to start, better time to start on this than on the anniversary of Olmstead decision that we celebrate every year.
I have one more thing to add, and it goes out particularly to the self-advocates on this call. Everybody out there has got gifts. Those gifts that you have, like here's Lois's a picture she did. Lois was an artist. And those are gifts that your community and your state needs to know about. Share your gifts. Let everybody know what you have to bring to the table, because if everyone understood how much that people with disabilities have to offer their communities, I think it would make it so much easier to get the resources that we need to make Olmstead a reality. So let your light shine, let people know what your gifts are. It's so important. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities, for having all of us.
Really appreciate it. All three of you and everyone who helped make today possible, including, of course, our translators and interpreters and cart captioners. I just want to remind people that we will be looking at the questions. I'll be serving up the questions that weren't answered today to the three speakers, and answers to those will be in our newsletter. So make sure you're on a mailing list. Make sure you stay registered for our webinars. Also, recording of this will be in the newsletter as well, all out by the end of the month. Next month, we look forward to talking about another important topic, IDD and health disparities, with Duke psychiatrist Dr. Gary Maslow and Dr. Michelle Franklin from the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. We really appreciate your joining us at the table today. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.
Stay
Thank
strong.
you.
Thanks, Beth.
We are people.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.